The software Microsoft blocked in April 2026 is exactly what Linux users have had for years: freely available, freely updatable, not subject to corporate account verification requirements, not dependent on any developer maintaining an account with any platform owner. VeraCrypt is on Linux. WireGuard is in the Linux kernel. LibreOffice ships by default on many Linux distributions. Windscribe has a Linux client that updates through exactly the same package management system as every other piece of software on the system. The Linux users who rely on these tools never spent a day wondering whether a certificate authority expiration date might prevent their encrypted drive from booting. They never waited for a social media escalation to reach an executive VP before getting their VPN protocol developer's account reviewed by a human being. The tools just work, and they keep working because the architecture of the platform does not place a corporate gatekeeper between the developer and the user. Like and subscribe, because the incident in April 2026 was described at the time as an administrative paperwork issue. That framing is technically accurate and completely misleading. What it actually was is a demonstration at production scale, affecting nearly 1 million users of one piece of software alone, of what platform dependency costs when the platform is controlled by a single corporation whose automated systems cannot tell the difference between software millions of people depend on and an account that deserves to be suspended. Linux knew this for years. In April 2026, Windows users found out. There is a dimension of this story that gets lost in the account suspension headlines and the drama of social media escalation, and it is the dimension that matters most for anyone thinking seriously about software infrastructure. The software that got blocked, VeraCrypt, WireGuard, Windscribe, is privacy and security software. It is not entertainment software. It is not productivity software. It is the software that people use when they need to be certain that nobody can access their data without their permission. VeraCrypt is used by journalists to protect source communications. It is used by activists in countries where their governments would imprison them for their writing. It is used by lawyers to protect client confidentiality. It is used by ordinary people who simply do not want a stolen laptop to expose their medical records, their financial documents, their private correspondence. WireGuard is used by people who route their internet traffic through a VPN specifically to prevent their internet service provider, their government, or a malicious network operator from seeing what they access. The fact that these specific tools, not games, not utilities, not productivity applications, but privacy and security infrastructure, were the ones that got swept up in an automated corporate compliance process and had their windows updates blocked, illustrates something important about the nature of platform dependency when the platform belongs to a corporation that has its own interests in the security and privacy ecosystem. Like and subscribe, because Microsoft makes BitLocker, Microsoft makes Windows Hello, Microsoft makes Defender. Microsoft has its own full disk encryption, its own VPN infrastructure through Azure, its own identity and authentication stack, the open source. Alternatives to all of those tools, VeraCrypt, WireGuard, Windscribe, compete with Microsoft's own products in the sense that they give users privacy and security options that exist outside Microsoft's ecosystem. Whether the account suspensions were intentional or bureaucratic does not change the structural observation that the corporate gatekeeper who blocked the update path for the independent alternatives is also the vendor of the competing products. On Linux, this structural conflict does not arise in the same way. The Linux distribution that ships VeraCrypt and WireGuard and LibreOffice has no competing products to protect. The kernel community that merged WireGuard into Linux 5.6 reviewed the code on its technical merits and merged it because it was excellent. The package maintainers who make VeraCrypt available through distribution repositories make it available because users want it, with no consideration of whether it competes with some other piece of software in the distribution's portfolio. The architecture that makes Linux software distribution work decentralized, meritocratic, community-governed eliminates the conflict of interest that is structurally embedded in a system where a single corporation controls both the platform and the distribution channel for software that competes with that corporation's own products. like and subscribe because the accounts got restored, the headlines moved on, and millions of Windows users went back. 2. Using Veracrypt and WireGuard without thinking about the incident again. But the architecture that made the incident possible is unchanged. The dependency is unchanged. The corporate gatekeeper is unchanged. And on Linux, none of this happens because it cannot happen. The software is already there. It has been there for years. It updates when the developer ships an update, not when a corporation's verification policy permits the update to pass through. That is the difference. The April 2026 incident put on display for anyone paying close enough attention to see it. One final point that deserves to be made clearly because it will come up in the comments and it deserves an honest answer. Some people will say that Microsoft's policy change was a legitimate security measure that requiring identity verification for kernel driver signing is a reasonable precaution against malicious actors using the hardware. Program 2 ship signed malware. That argument is not wrong. Driver signing exists for a real reason. Unsigned kernel code is a vector for rootkits and other malware that needs to operate below the operating system's security layer. Microsoft's requirement that developers verify their identity before signing drivers is a genuine security control, not a pretextual one. The problem is not that the policy exists. The problem is that the automated enforcement of the policy applied identically to Veracrypt software with a decade of security audit history and nearly 1 million users and to a hypothetical abandoned account used by a fictional bad actor. The design of the policy did not account for the difference between those two categories of developer, the implementation of the appeals process did not create a path for critical infrastructure developers to have their accounts reviewed by a human being without first generating enough social media noise to reach an executive VP through a third party. Like and subscribe because the lesson is not that security controls are bad. The lesson is that security controls designed without consideration for their impact on independent open source developers, implemented through automated systems without meaningful human oversight, and operated by a corporation that also sells competing products will periodically produce outcomes exactly like April 2026, where the software blocking and the delay in resolution fall hardest on exactly the users who most need their privacy and security tools to keep working. Linux solved this problem architecturally, not by eliminating security controls, but by distributing the control across a community that has no conflict of interest in which software gets to ship updates. That is the difference, and it is a difference worth understanding clearly, regardless of which operating system you use. There was no path to deliver it to Windows users because a government ID verification process had not been completed in an administrative system most open source developers have no routine reason to interact with. WireGuard's code was secure. WireGuard's developer was reachable and working. Microsoft's bureaucracy was not like and subscribe because on Linux, WireGuard is in the kernel, not an optional driver that requires a signed certificate from a hardware program. The kernel, it ships by default in every major Linux distribution. There is no Microsoft, no Apple, no corporate gatekeeper between you and the ability to use it. Other projects caught by the same automated verification sweep extended the scope of the problem beyond the 3 names that made headlines. LibreOffice, the open source Office suite used by governments, universities, and millions of individuals worldwide as the free alternative to Microsoft Office also had its developer account affected. MemTest 86 software used to test computer memory for faults installed on practically every system administrator's boot drive was caught by the same policy. The pattern revealed by all of these cases is consistent and worth stating plainly. Microsoft's automated enforcement system treated Veracrypt and WireGuard and LibreOffice identically to abandoned hobby projects and fraudulent accounts because the automated system does not know the difference between a project that has been running in production on millions of machines for a decade and a shell account someone created to push malware. The automation does not distinguish between them. Only human review can distinguish them. and the automation specifically eliminates the human review step until the social media pressure gets loud enough to escalate to an executive VP. Pavan Davuluri became aware of the situation because Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney highlighted the issue publicly, not because Microsoft's support system identified critical open source software developers as a category requiring special handling, because a different technology executive posted about it in a way that reached the right person inside Microsoft. Like and subscribe, because the dependency on a well-connected third party to get a human being at Microsoft to look at your account is not an edge case. It is a structural feature of what it means to be an open source developer on a platform controlled by a corporation. The resolution was partial and the timeline was slow. Scott Hanselman, Microsoft VP and member of technical staff, commented publicly that the situation was an administrative paperwork issue rather than an intentional enforcement action against the projects. He said he had personally emailed Veracrypt's developer and spoken to WireGuard's creator. WireGuard's account was restored relatively quickly after the public backlash. Veracrypt's situation remained unresolved for a significantly longer period with no confirmed timeline for restoration. Windscribe spent over a month trying to resolve its account suspension before the public attention brought a resolution. Microsoft confirmed the accounts would be reinstated but did not announce any changes to its verification enforcement policy for open source developers going forward, meaning that the same automated process that swept up Veracrypt, WireGuard, and LibreOffice remains in place, with no structural change to prevent the same scenario from repeating. Like and subscribe, because this is the part of the story that goes unexamined in most coverage. The accounts got fixed, the headlines moved on, and the underlying architecture that made the incident possible is unchanged. That underlying architecture is what makes the Linux comparison not just rhetorically convenient, but technically essential too. Understanding what happened on Linux, Veracrypt installs and runs without requiring any developer to maintain an account with any corporation. The software is open source. The user compiles it or installs it from a package repository maintained by the Linux distribution they use. The signature that validates the package comes from the distribution's own signing keys, which the distribution controls and which exist to protect users from tampered packages, not to give a corporation veto power over which updates can be shipped. When Veracrypt ships a security update on Linux, the update goes to the package repository and becomes available to users within hours. No Microsoft account, no certificate authority with an expiration date controlled by a third party. No 60-day appeals process, no need to reach a human being at a corporation. Through the mediation of a prominent tech CEO, like and subscribe, because this is the functional meaning of the difference between open and closed platform architecture, and it has direct, practical consequences for the security of the software that runs on those platforms. WireGuard on Linux is even more instructive because it illustrates where the architectural difference actually comes from. WireGuard was merged into the Linux kernel mainline in March 2020 with kernel version 5.6. That merge was the result of Linus Torvalds reviewing Jason Dunnenfeld's code and describing it as a work of art compared to the existing VPN implementations in the kernel. Once code is in the Linux mainline kernel, it ships with every distribution that uses that kernel version. It is updated when the kernel is updated. It is maintained by the kernel development community. No corporate gatekeeper stands between the developer and the users. No driver signing program. No hardware verification requirement. The same Jason Donenfeld who spent weeks trying to get a human being at Microsoft to review his account suspension simply submits patches to the Linux kernel TRIA process governed by the Linux kernel community's own meritocratic review process, not by Microsoft's identity verification policy. On Linux, WireGuard is not subject to account suspension because there is no account to suspend. The code is in the kernel. Like and subscribe, because Donenfeld himself built the Windows version of WireGuard specifically so that Windows users could benefit from the protocol, and the story of what happened to his Windows account is the story of what it costs to bring open source software onto a platform that requires corporate permission to ship updates. The broader pattern this incident exposes goes well beyond April 2026. Windows requires driver signing for kernel level code. Driver signing requires a Microsoft developer account. Microsoft developer accounts are subject to Microsoft's policies, which can change, and to Microsoft's enforcement, which can be automated. That chain of dependencies means that every piece of open source software that needs kernel access on Windows exists in a state of permanent conditional permission. It runs because Microsoft has not yet withdrawn the developer's account. The question of whether that permission will remain available is not a question about the quality of the code or the legitimacy of the project or the security of the software. It is a question about whether the developer has met a set of administrative requirements that change over time and are enforced by automated systems that cannot distinguish between critical infrastructure and abandoned projects. On Linux, that question does not exist in the same form. Kernel code is governed by the kernel development community. Package distribution is governed by distribution maintainers. No single corporation holds the signing keys to the entire ecosystem. Like and subscribe, because that architectural difference, which sounds abstract until VeraCrypt users are staring at a potential boot failure deadline and WireGuard's developer is sitting with a useless code signing certificate, is one of the most concrete and consequential differences between the two platforms. In April 2026, three of the most important pieces of security software that Windows users rely on suddenly stopped receiving updates, not because the developers stopped working, not because the software had security vulnerabilities, not because there was anything wrong with the code, because Microsoft's automated bureaucracy suspended the developer accounts of VeraCrypt, WireGuard, and Windscribe. Without warning, without explanation, and without any meaningful path to appeal. The creator of VeraCrypt, which nearly 1 million Windows users had downloaded in the year before this incident, received a message saying his account did not meet verification requirements. No details, no appeal option, no human being to call. The creator of WireGuard, the VPN protocol that underpins Mullvad, Proton VPN, Tailscale, and dozens of other commercial privacy services used by hundreds of millions of people, tried to certify a new driver update and found his account showing as access restricted. He went through the identity verification process with the third-party service Microsoft uses. He was verified. His account stayed suspended, and every Windows user who depends on WireGuard was left waiting for updates while the developer spent weeks trying to get a human being at Microsoft to answer a message. Like and subscribe right now, because the thing that makes this story genuinely extraordinary is not just what Microsoft did. It is what it revealed. Every single piece of software that got blocked, VeraCrypt, WireGuard, Windscribe, has been available to Linux users completely free, without any permission required from any corporation for years. No developer account, no verification deadline, no automated bureaucracy with a 60-day appeals process. You install it, it runs. Nobody can take it away from you. Let's start with what actually happened, because the technical details matter and most coverage glossed over them. Microsoft operates something called the Windows Hardware Program. This is the system that allows developers to create accounts and use them to sign the kernel drivers that their software requires to function at a low level inside Windows. A kernel driver is not optional for software like VeraCrypt or WireGuard. It is the component that allows the software to interact with the operating system at the layer it needs to reach to do its job. VeraCrypt needs to intercept disk read and write operations to perform encryption and decryption transparently before data is written to storage. WireGuard needs to create a virtual network interface at the kernel level to route traffic through the VPN tunnel efficiently. These operations require kernel access. Kernel access requires assigned driver. Assigned driver requires a Microsoft developer account. A Microsoft developer account requires compliance with Microsoft's policies. This is the dependency chain that means Microsoft, as a practical matter, controls whether encryption and VPN software can ship updates to Windows users, like and subscribe, because that control, which has existed for years but has been mostly invisible, became very visible in April 2026 when Microsoft's automated policy enforcement swept up three projects that millions of people depend on for their privacy and security. The specific trigger was a mandatory identity verification requirement that Microsoft rolled out in October 2025 for all partners enrolled in the Windows hardware program who had not completed verification since April 2024. The policy required developers to verify their identity using a government-issued ID that matched the name on their Partner Center primary contact account. The deadline was October 16, 2025, with a 30-day notification window. Miss the deadline, fail the verification, or get caught in an administrative mismatch and your account gets suspended. No further submissions allowed. No driver signing. No updates. Microsoft's executive VP for Windows and devices, Pavan Davuluri, said after the incident became public that the company had been sending emails, banners, and reminders to affected partners since the policy was announced. He acknowledged that the company's messaging had clearly failed to reach several high-profile developers. The Veracrypt developer, Munir Idrasi, said he received no emails or prior warnings. The WireGuard creator, Jason Donenfeld, discovered his account was suspended when he tried to certify a new kernel driver that he had been building for weeks. The Windscribe team said they had been trying to resolve their account suspension for over a month before going public, getting nowhere, receiving no human support, and asked publicly on social media whether anyone knew a human with a brain that still works at Microsoft who could help, like, and subscribe. Because that question from the team behind a widely used VPN service trying to ship a security update to their Windows users is one of the more perfectly constructed summaries of what it is like to depend on a platform controlled by a corporation that is too large to have a person answer the phone. The stakes were not abstract. For Veracrypt specifically, the suspension was not just an inconvenience, it was a countdown to a potential catastrophe for nearly 1 million Windows users. Veracrypt encrypts entire operating system drives, the bootloader. The code that runs before the operating system starts and decrypts the drive to allow the system to boot is a signed component that depends on a certificate authority maintained by Microsoft. That certificate authority was scheduled to be revoked after July 2026. Once revoked, Windows systems with secure boot enabled might refuse to load the Veracrypt bootloader entirely, or might trigger boot failures because the signature would no longer chain back to a trusted authority. The developer Munir Idrasi warned explicitly that if the account issue was not resolved before the certificate revocation, it would essentially be a death sentence for Veracrypt. Not for the software itself. Veracrypt would continue to work on Linux and MacOS, where no corporate gatekeeper controls the ability to ship updates. But for Windows users who had encrypted their drives with Veracrypt, the expiration would mean their systems might not boot. Data encrypted but inaccessible is data lost, practically speaking. Like and subscribe, because the specific nature of that threat, a piece of software you installed to protect your data, potentially locking you out of your data because a corporation revoked a certificate, is one of the clearest possible illustrations of what platform dependency actually costs. WireGuard's situation was different in specifics but identical in structure. Jason Donenfeld had spent weeks modernizing WireGuard's Windows driver infrastructure to pass the Windows Hardware Lab Kit test suite, a significant engineering investment that would have improved WireGuard's Windows integration in meaningful ways. When he finished and went to certify the driver, he found his account suspended. The lockout did not just block the update he had been working on, it made the extended validation code signing certificate he had recently purchased, which costs hundreds of dollars and exists specifically to make driver signing possible, entirely useless. Donenfeld told TechCrunch that if there had been a critical security vulnerability to fix in WireGuard for Windows at that moment, users would have been completely exposed. The infrastructure for shipping the fix existed. The fix could have been written and tested.